They said the king had gone mad. They said he was tearing the kingdom apart looking for a ghost. Selene touched her belly, swollen and taut beneath her worn tunic, and knew the truth. The ghost he searched for was her, and the kingdom he was destroying was the one that would have belonged to their unborn children. 6 years. It had been 6 long years since the Great Hall, since the scent of winter roses and betrayal had filled her lungs. 6 years since the man she loved, her fated mate, King Alaric, had chosen another. The memory was a shard of ice lodged permanently in her heart. The Great Hall had been a sea of shifting bodies, the air thick with the scents of pine, earth, and anticipation. Every noble house, every alpha from every territory, had gathered for the king's choosing. Selene had stood in the shadows near the servants' entrance, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The burning mark on her hip, a delicate silver whorl shaped like a howling wolf, was a thrumming beacon of heat, a physical manifestation of the mate bond that had snapped into place the moment she'd first laid eyes on him. He had felt it too. She'd seen it in the way his molten gold eyes had found hers across a crowded courtyard, the way the air had crackled between them. He'd sought her out in the gardens, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her soul. He'd promised her everything. He'd sworn on the moon itself that she was his and he was hers. But on that night, under the cold, judging eyes of the court, something was wrong. His golden eyes were glassy, unfocused. He walked past her as if she were nothing more than a shadow on the stone wall. The bond screamed, a silent, agonizing shriek that only she could hear. He stopped before Lady Lysara Van Thorn, her crimson dress a slash of violence in the torchlight. Lysara, with her venomous smile and eyes as cold as a winter frost, preened under his vacant gaze. When Alaric took her hand and announced her as his chosen queen, the bond between him and Selene didn't just fray, it shattered. The pain was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The silver mark on her hip turned black and burned with a cold fire, a brand of rejection and agony. She had fled. With the help of Marta, the old pack healer who saw the truth in the king's clouded eyes, Selene had vanished into the night. It was Marta who had pressed a pouch of coins into her hand and whispered of a forgotten cottage deep in the Whisperwood. It was Marta who had looked at Selene's still flat stomach with knowing eyes and said, "The royal line must survive. Protect the heir." The heir. A secret she hadn't even known herself. A tiny life conceived in a stolen week of bliss before the choosing. That secret was now a boy of 6, with a shock of black hair and the king's own eyes of molten gold. Her Leo. The cottage door exploded inward. The sound was a deafening crack of splintering wood and shattered iron. Selene didn't hesitate. She threw herself over Leo, who was sitting on the floor with his wooden wolf, shielding his small body with her own. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. The hunters had finally found them. The air filled with the unfamiliar, acrid scents of strange wolves, sweat, and oiled leather. Through the ruined doorway, 2 figures stepped, clad in black, their faces obscured by cowls. They carried crossbows, the bolts tipped with the sickly green sheen of concentrated wolfsbane. "Well, well," one of them rasped, his voice a gravelly sneer. "The little ghost and her pup." His eyes, cold and merciless, fixed on Leo. "Lady Lysara sends her regards. She is tired of the king's moods, tired of him howling for a phantom only he can scent. She thinks a clean slate is in order." Selena's blood ran cold. Lysara. Of course. The false queen, the usurper who had stolen her life. Now she had come to steal her sons. A guttural growl, low and primal, rumbled in Selena's chest, a sound she didn't know she was capable of making. Her protective instincts flared, a raging inferno that burned away all fear, leaving only a white-hot resolve. They would not touch her son. They would not take the last piece of her shattered heart. She would die first. She would kill first. Back in the capital, King Alaric slammed a fist into the stone map table, cracking the ancient oak from end to end. Maps of the territories fluttered to the floor, useless parchments that could not lead him to her. "Find her!" he roared, the sound more beast than man. His council flinched. The guards lining the walls shifted, their hands tightening on their spears. His madness was the kingdom's new religion, and they were all unwilling converts. He was a king in tatters. His black hair was a wild mane, his golden eyes burned with a feverish light, and his royal finery was often stained with dirt and blood from his frantic nightly searches. He would shift and run until his paws bled, chasing a scent that was always on the edge of his senses, a phantom fragrance of moon blossom and forgotten promises. The bond, or what was left of it, was a constant torment. The mark on his hip, once a source of warmth and connection, was now a patch of deadened, aching flesh, a constant reminder of a gaping hole in his soul. He remembered fragments, nightmarish visions that made no sense. Her face, a heart-shaped face with eyes the color of a forest floor after the rain, fading from his mind's eye. The scent of her being scrubbed from his senses by the cloying, artificial perfume of Lysara's winter roses. He remembered a fire in his veins, a fog in his head. He remembered standing in the great hall, his own voice a stranger's as it named Lysara. He'd woken 3 days later, screaming a name no one at court recognized. Selene. Lysara would approach him in these moments, her touch like ice, her voice a silken trap. "My love," she would murmur, "the stress of the crown weighs heavily on you. You are unwell. Let me soothe you." Her presence was an irritant, her scent a violation. He could barely stand to be in the same room with the woman he had supposedly chosen, the woman who wore the title of queen, but could never touch the hollowed-out space in his soul. He knew, with a certainty that defied his shattered memory, that she was a lie. A walking, breathing lie, draped in silks and jewels. His loyal beta, Brennan, watched him with eyes full of sorrow and concern. Brennan was an old soldier, his face a roadmap of scars, and his loyalty to the true Alpha King absolute. He did not believe the official story, that the king had suffered a sudden breakdown after the choosing. He had seen the way Alaric had looked at the servant girl, Selene. He'd seen the life in his king's eyes when she was near, and he saw the living death in them now. Brennan had quietly begun his own investigation, speaking to the servants who had been dismissed, the guards who had been reassigned. He'd spoken to old Marta, the healer, just before she too had vanished from the capital. Her last words to him had been a cryptic warning. The deepest roots of the royal line grow in the darkest soil. Look to the whisperwood, where the old magic still sleeps. For 6 years Brennan had searched. He had followed whispers and rumors, chasing the ghost the king howled for. And now, a lead from a trapper about a reclusive woman and a boy with golden eyes living in a forgotten part of the forest had finally given him a direction. He rode hard, his heart a mix of hope and dread. He prayed to the moon he wasn't too late. He prayed the king's madness hadn't driven away the only person who could possibly cure it. He prayed for the soul of his kingdom, which was fraying and tearing apart, just like its king. He did not yet know that his path was converging with that of Lysara's assassins, that the race to find the hidden queen was about to reach its bloody, desperate conclusion at the door of a remote cottage deep in the woods. The first assassin raised his crossbow, the wicked-looking bolt aimed directly at Leo's chest. Selene moved with a speed she didn't know she possessed. She shoved the small table in their path, sending wooden bowls and dried herbs scattering across the floor. It was a pathetic defense, but it bought her a precious second. She scooped Leo into her arms and scrambled toward the back of the one-room cottage, her mind racing. There was no escape. The only other exit was a small window, too high and too small to climb through quickly.
"Nowhere to run, little mother," the second assassin chuckled, stepping over the overturned table. His movements were fluid, predatory. These were not common thugs, they were trained killers. Lady Lysara was very specific. The boy first. She wants you to watch. A wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed over Selene. The dormant wolf within her, a creature she had suppressed and ignored for years, stirred with a violence that shocked her. Her hands curled into claws, her teeth grinding together. "You will not touch him," she snarled, the words a feral promise. She gently pushed Leo behind her, positioning herself as a human shield. Her son, bless his brave heart, wasn't crying. His small hands were balled into fists, and his golden eyes, so like his father's, blazed with a defiant fire. The first assassin laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Brave words from a nobody. You were a servant who forgot her place. Now you pay the price." He leveled the crossbow again. The world seemed to slow down. Selene could see the intricate fletching on the bolt, the way the torchlight glinted off its poisoned tip. This was it. This was the end of her stolen life, the end of her son's future. She closed her eyes, bracing for the impact, a prayer for Leo's soul on her lips. A crash from outside shattered the tense silence. Not the sound of splintering wood, but of a massive body hitting the cottage's outer wall with enough force to shake the very foundations. The assassins whirled around, momentarily startled. Through the ruined doorway, Selene saw a flash of silver-grey fur and the glint of moonlight on weathered steel. Brennan. He had found them. The old beater was a storm of righteous fury. He moved with the deadly grace of a seasoned warrior, his long sword a blur of motion. He engaged the second assassin, his blade clashing against the man's short sword in a shower of sparks. "Get the boy and run!" Brennan roared to Selene, his eyes never leaving his opponent. "I will hold them!" But the first assassin had recovered his composure. He ignored Brennan, his focus still locked on his primary target. He raised his crossbow once more. Before he could fire, Selene acted. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the hearth, the only weapon within reach, and threw it with all her might. It struck the assassin's arm, causing his shot to go wide. The bolt thudded harmlessly into the wooden wall, mere inches from her head. He swore, shaking his stinging arm, his eyes narrowing with murderous intent. He dropped the crossbow and drew a long, cruel-looking dagger. "You've just made your death painful, wench." Meanwhile, Brennan fought valiantly, but he was 1 against 2. The assassin he was fighting was younger, fast. While Brennan parried a thrust, the dagger-wielding assassin saw his opening. He lunged not at Selene, but at Brennan's exposed back. Selene screamed a warning, but it was too late. The dagger plunged deep into the old wolf's side. Brennan grunted in pain, his sword arm faltering. His opponent seized the advantage, driving his own sword through Brennan's shoulder. The loyal beater collapsed to one knee, his lifeblood staining the floorboards red. The 2 assassins now stood over him, their victory assured. They turned their cold eyes back to Selene and Leo. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. Brennan had tried. He had found her, and he had died for her. Now, her and Leo's fate was sealed. It was then that a howl tore through the night. It was not the call of a common wolf. This was a sound of pure, undiluted agony and rage, a sound that resonated deep in Selene's bones and made the very air tremble. It was a sound of a king's despair, of a mate's fury. The assassins froze, their heads snapping toward the forest.
Even in their hardened cruelty, that sound inspired a primal fear. The world outside the cottage erupted into chaos. Trees cracked as if struck by lightning. A furious whirlwind of black fur and elemental power descended upon the cottage. The entire front wall of the small structure didn't just break, it disintegrated. A colossal black wolf, larger than any she had ever seen, stood amidst the wreckage, its eyes burning with the light of molten gold. Its fur was matted with dirt and leaves, its massive body scarred and lean, but its power was undeniable. It was the power of an alpha king. It was Alaric. He wasn't sane. This was not the king she remembered from the gardens. This was a feral beast, driven by the raw, instinctual need to protect his mate and his offspring. A need that had finally, violently, clawed its way through the fog of poison and madness. The scent of her fear, her son's terror, and the foreign stink of the assassins had been a clarion call his broken soul could not ignore. The assassins were paralyzed for a fatal second. It was all the feral king needed. He moved faster than thought, a blur of black shadow and gleaming teeth. He tore into the first assassin, his powerful jaws closing around the man's throat. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud. He tossed the body aside like a broken doll and immediately lunged for the second. The man tried to raise his sword, but he was impossibly outmatched. Alaric's claws, as long and sharp as daggers, ripped through leather and flesh. The assassin's scream was cut short as the great wolf's fury descended upon him. In moments, it was over. The two killers lay broken and still on the cottage floor. The great black wolf stood over them, its chest heaving, its muzzle dripping with blood. Then, its burning golden eyes, filled with a wild and terrible light, turned to her. Celine instinctively tightened her hold on Leo, her heart caught between terror and a desperate, illogical hope. The beast took a step toward them, and its form began to shimmer and contort. Bones cracked and reformed with sickening speed. The black fur receded, melting away to reveal the human form of her king. Alaric stood before her, naked, covered in the blood of his enemies and the dust of his mad journey. He was thinner than she remembered, haunted, but he was still the most powerful man she had ever known. His eyes, no longer burning with feral rage, were now wide with a dawning, horrified confusion. He stared at her, his lips parting on a silent gasp. The name came out as a broken whisper, a prayer. Celine? His gaze dropped from her face to the small boy clinging to her leg. He saw the shock of black hair. He saw the golden eyes, a perfect mirror of his own. The world seemed to tilt on its axis for the Alpha King. The ghost he had been chasing had flesh and blood, and she had a child. His child. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, staggering him. He fell to his knees in the wreckage of her home, his trembling hand hovering in the air, reaching not for her, but for the son he never knew he had. "May I?" he whispered, his voice raw with 1,000 emotions, disbelief, awe, unbearable regret. Celine, her own eyes filled with tears, gave a slight, hesitant nod. Alaric slowly, reverently, rested his hand on Leo's small head. The moment his skin touched his son's, a jolt, electric and profound, shot through all three of them. The fragmented bond between Alaric and Celine flared with a sudden, searing heat, and Leo, their son, the living bridge between their two souls, looked up at his father with wonder, not fear. And the Alpha King, the mad king who had torn his kingdom apart, wept. He wept for the 6 years he had lost, for the lies he had believed, for the son he had never known, and for the woman he had almost destroyed. A weak groan from the floor broke the spell. Brennan. Celine rushed to his side, her newfound fury at the world momentarily forgotten.
replaced by a desperate need to save the man who had laid down his life for them. The wounds were grievous. The dagger wound in his side was deep, and the sword had pierced his shoulder through and through. He was fading, his breathing shallow, his scent turning to the pale, dusty smell of death.
"Marta, tell her," Brennan coughed, blood flecking his lips. "I found them. "Save your strength, old friend," Alaric said, his voice thick with grief as he moved to kneel beside his fallen beta. He knew the wounds were fatal. He had seen 1,000 like them on the battlefield. There was nothing to be done. But Selene refused to accept it. A fierce, defiant energy surged through her, a power she had never felt before. It wasn't the rage of a mother wolf. It was something else, something ancient and bright. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling with a strange new authority. "He will not die." She placed her hands over Brennan's most grievous wound. She closed her eyes and focused, not on the blood and the damage, but on the spark of life still flickering within him. She called to it, nurtured it, willed it to burn brighter. And then it happened. A soft golden light began to emanate from her palms, bathing Brennan's broken body in a warm, ethereal glow. The light grew in intensity, pouring from her like water from a spring. Alaric stared, his grief-stricken face filled with utter astonishment. He could feel the magic in the air, a pure healing power that felt as old as the moon itself. Under her hands, the torn flesh began to knit itself back together. The flow of blood slowed, then stopped. Color returned to Brennan's face, his breathing evening out, growing stronger. Selene poured everything she had into the act, her own energy draining as she channeled this incredible power. When she finally pulled her hands away, panting from the exertion, the fatal wounds were gone, leaving behind only smooth, unblemished skin and torn, bloody cloth. Brennan's eyes fluttered open, no longer glazed with pain, but clear and sharp with disbelief. He looked from his healed body to Selene, his mouth agape. Alaric looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time in 6 years. He saw not just the servant girl he had fallen for, but a woman radiating an ancient, formidable power. He saw the mother of his child. He saw his queen. The pieces of his fractured memory began to slam back into place, propelled by the shock of the magic and the undeniable reality of his son. The fog in his mind burned away, revealing the sharp, ugly truth of his betrayal. "The wine," he choked out, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He remembered now. The night of the choosing, Lysara had brought him a goblet of wine, her smile cloying and sweet. He'd drunk it, to be polite. And then the fire had started, the confusion, the world turning grey and distant. Her scent, the cloying winter roses, had overwhelmed everything, scrubbing Selene's moonblossom fragrance from his senses. "I did not choose her," Alaric roared, the sound echoing through the ruined cottage. It was a cry of pure anguish and fury. He staggered to his feet, his golden eyes blazing with a terrible, newfound clarity. "I was drugged, poisoned. I woke up 3 days later screaming your name, and they told me I was mad. They told me you were a figment of a fever dream." He turned his tormented gaze back to Selene. "They stole you from me. They stole my son." The full weight of Lysara's betrayal crashed down upon him. It wasn't just a political maneuver. It was a violation of the most sacred law of their people, a desecration of a true mate bond. She had not only stolen his throne and his mind, but she had also nearly cost him his soul. The feral madness that had driven him for 6 years was now gone, replaced by a cold, clear, and infinitely more dangerous rage. The Mad King was gone. The true Alpha King had returned. and his retribution would be swift and absolute. He would not just reclaim his kingdom, he would burn the world down to see the woman who had done this pay for her crimes. He looked at Selene, his true mate, and Leo, his heir, and made a silent vow. The hunt was over. Now the war would begin. The journey back to the capital was a tense, hurried affair. Brennan, miraculously healed but still shaken, procured horses from a nearby village where his name still commanded respect. Alaric, dressed in borrowed clothes that fit his large frame poorly, never let Selene or Leo out of his sight. The king's feral madness had been replaced by a focused, lethal intensity. The constant ache in his soul, a dull throb that had been his companion for 6 years, was now a humming warmth, soothed by Selene's proximity. He found himself watching her constantly, marveling at the strength she had cultivated in her exile. She had survived, she had raised their son, and she possessed a power he had never dreamed of. She was more than he had ever deserved. Selene, for her part, was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. The man she had loved and lost was back, but he was a stranger in many ways, harder and more dangerous. Yet, when he looked at Leo, a raw tenderness softened his harsh features, and she saw a glimpse of the Alaric she remembered from the garden. The fear that had been her constant companion was slowly being replaced by a fragile, budding hope. She was no longer a servant hiding in the woods. She was the mother of the heir, and the true mate of the Alpha King. What that meant for her future, she didn't dare to imagine. Leo was the bridge between them. He was initially wary of the giant, sad-eyed man who had appeared in a storm of violence, but a child's intuition is a powerful thing. He could feel the connection, the invisible thread that tied him to this man. He would watch Alaric with his solemn golden eyes, and Alaric would watch him back, his expression the mixture of profound love and devastating regret. One evening, as they made camp, Alaric sat with Leo by the fire, carving a piece of wood with a small knife. He wasn't shaping a wolf, but a great, soaring eagle. "Your mother," Alaric said, his voice low and raspy. "She once told me she dreamed of flying, of being free from the shadows of the court." He looked at Selene, his eyes conveying a silent apology that spoke volumes. "I should have given her wings. Instead, I let them cage her." He handed the finished carving to Leo. "You have her strength, little one. And my fire. You will be a king who protects the free, not one who builds cages." As they drew closer to the capital, they began to encounter patrols. Brennan's presence ensured they were not immediately attacked, but the news of the king's return with a mysterious woman and child spread like wildfire. They gathered a small but fiercely loyal contingent of warriors, men who had grown disillusioned with Lysara's cold, manipulative rule and the kingdom's decline. They had watched their king descend into madness and their lands suffer, and the sight of him now, clear-eyed, focused, and with a rightful queen by his side, was enough to reignite their fealty. The capital was a reflection of its false queen. The vibrant, lively heart of the kingdom had become a place of muted colors, suspicion, and fear. Lysara's personal guard, the Sterling Guard, patrolled the streets, their wolf sigils a mockery of the true pack loyalty they were supposed to represent. When Alaric, Selene, Leo, and their small band of loyalists rode through the main gates, a hush fell over the city. People stared from windows and doorways, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning hope. The Mad King had returned, but he did not look mad. He looked like a king on the verge of war. Lysara was holding court in the great hall, the very site of Selene's heartbreak. She sat upon the throne beside the empty one that belonged to Alaric, her expression one of bored contempt as she listened to some minor land dispute. When the great doors to the hall were thrown open, she looked up, her annoyance turning to pure shock as Alaric strode in, his presence commanding the absolute attention of every person in the room. Selene walked beside him, her head held high, her hand holding Leo's tightly. "Alaric," Lysara breathed, recovering quickly, a practiced smile stretching her lips. She rose from the throne. "My love, you have returned. I was so worried."
"These wild flights of yours." "Silence!" Alaric's voice was not a shout, but a low, deadly command that cut through her words like a blade. The hall fell utterly silent. "You will no longer address me. You will no longer sit on a throne you are not worthy of. Your reign of lies is over." Lysara's eyes darted from Alaric's cold face to Selene. A flicker of recognition, followed by pure, venomous hatred, crossed her features. "You," she hissed, her composure cracking. "The servant girl. I thought my men had disposed of you and your bastard." The word hung in the air, ugly and poisonous. Alaric took a protective step in front of Selene and Leo, his body thrumming with a barely controlled rage. "You will not speak of my son or my mate in that tone ever again. You will not speak at all, unless it is to confess your treason." Lysara laughed, a high, brittle sound that echoed unnervingly in the silent hall. "Treason? I saved this kingdom. You were losing your mind, unfit to rule. I stepped in, as was my duty. The council approved our union. You chose me." "I chose nothing," Alaric roared, the sound shaking the tapestries on the walls. "You poisoned me with a wolfsbane compound, clouded my mind, and severed my bond with my true mate. You sent assassins to murder my heir. You are no queen. You are a traitor and a murderer." Panic flashed in Lysara's eyes. She looked around at the assembled court, at the stoic faces of the pack alphas, at the shifting, uncertain eyes of her own guards. Her support was evaporating. She was cornered, a viper with its fangs drawn, looking for one last place to strike. Her gaze fell upon Leo, who clung to his mother's side, his small face a mask of fear and defiance. In that moment, Lysara made her final, critical mistake. She saw not a child, but the single greatest obstacle to her ambition, the living proof of her lies. With a desperate snarl, she moved. She was faster than anyone anticipated. She snatched a decorative dagger from the belt of a nearby guard and lunged, not at Alaric, not at Selene, but at the small, defenseless boy standing between them. "If I cannot have the throne," she shrieked, her face a contorted mask of madness, "then no one will. The Blackwood line ends today." Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing. Alaric roared and moved to intercept, but he was a fraction of a second too late. Brennan drew his sword, but he was too far away. The entire court gasped in collective horror. The dagger arced through the air, its polished tip aimed directly at Leo's heart. It was then that Selene's world exploded. The last vestiges of the frightened, hiding servant burned away, consumed by an ancient cataclysmic power. The unconditional, absolute love for her child became the fuel for a transformation that had lain dormant in her bloodline for 1,000 years. Pain exploded behind her eyes. Golden light, brilliant and blinding, flooded the room, erupting from her in a shockwave that threw nearby guards from their feet. A sound like the cracking of ancient stones and the roar of a celestial storm filled the great hall. Where Selene, the servant girl, had stood, a creature of breathtaking power and myth now towered. A great white wolf, larger even than Alaric's alpha form, stood over Leo, her body a living shield. Her fur was the color of fresh fallen snow under a full moon, and her eyes, once the color of a forest floor, now burned with the inner fire of amber stars.
She was radiant, lethal, and utterly magnificent. The legendary White Wolf, the moon mother of the ancient tales, had been reborn. She moved with impossible speed. She didn't bat the weapon away. She caught the dagger in her massive clawed hand, the steel blade crumpling in her grip as if it were soft wax. She held Lysara's wrist in the same hand, her grip unbreakable, lifting the false queen effortlessly off the ground. Lysara dangled there, her eyes wide with terror and disbelief, staring into the face of a living legend. The entire court was frozen, silent witnesses to an act of impossible magic. They were not just seeing a shifter, they were seeing a god. The White Wolf did not speak in words, but her voice echoed in the minds of everyone present, a voice of ancient authority and absolute judgment. You threatened my child. You defiled a sacred bond. You have forfeited your place in this pack. With a flick of her wrist, she threw Lysara across the hall. The usurper crashed into the stone base of the empty throne, collapsing in a heap, not dead, but broken and utterly defeated. The White Wolf then turned, her massive form shrinking, the golden light receding until Selene stood once more in her place, her simple dress untouched, her eyes still glowing with a faint, residual amber light. She knelt and pulled Leo into a fierce embrace, burying her face in his hair, her body trembling with the aftermath of the power that had surged through her. Alaric stared, his heart filled with an awe so profound it bordered on worship. He had known she was special. He had not known she was divine. He walked to her, knelt before her and his son, and gently placed his hand over hers on Leo's back. In front of the entire kingdom, the Alpha King bowed his head to his true queen. The reclamation was complete. The reign of the White Wolf Queen was about to begin. The aftermath in the great hall was one of stunned, reverent silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The pack alphas, the council members, the guards, they all stared at the woman who had just manifested the power of a legend. Lysara's sterling guard, seeing their leader broken and their king bowing to another, threw down their weapons, their false loyalty dissolving in the face of true, divine authority. They knelt, one by one, their heads bowed in submission. Lysara was dragged away, weeping and spitting curses, her threats now sounding like the pathetic whimpers of a beaten dog. Her co-conspirators, those on the council who had aided her ascent and covered her tracks, were quickly identified by a now clear-headed Alaric and a grimly efficient Brennan. Their justice would be swift. The kingdom needed to be purged of the poison that had festered for 6 long years. But for Alaric, there was only one act of justice that mattered. He stood before Selene, who was still kneeling, holding their son. He gently helped her to her feet, his hands trembling slightly as they touched her arms. He looked into her eyes, no longer just the brown eyes of a servant he'd fallen in love with, but the amber-flecked eyes of a queen who had saved them all. The depth of his failure, his inability to protect her, washed over him with crushing weight. "Selene," he began, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I have no words. I'm sorry is an insult to what you have endured. I was a king, and I let myself be blinded. I was your mate, and I let them turn me against you. I failed you. I failed our son." He looked around the great hall, at all the assembled witnesses, ensuring they all heard his penance. "I was not worthy of you then. I am not worthy of you now. But I will spend every day for the rest of my life trying to be." He went down on one knee before her, an act of submission no Alpha King had made in centuries. He took her hand and pressed it to his lips. "You are my queen. In truth, you always were. But the bond, it is still damaged, scarred by the poison and the rejection. He looked up at her, his golden eyes pleading. It must be made whole. It must be completed, by your will, not by a fate I once threw away. He rose and turned, exposing the vulnerable line of his neck and shoulder. The entire hall held its breath. This was the most sacred rite, the final step in the mating bond. It was an act of ultimate trust, giving the queen the power to claim her king, to mark him as hers forever. "Claim me," he whispered, his voice for her alone, a raw and desperate plea. "Make it complete." Selene looked at this powerful, broken man who was her other half. She saw the years of torment in his eyes, the self-loathing, the profound love. She thought of the 6 years of lonely fear, but also of the 6 years of pure, undiluted joy she'd had with Leo. Their past was scarred, but their future was a blank page. She reached up, her hand gently tracing the line of his jaw. Her wolf, the great white wolf, was a calm, steady presence within her now, humming with contentment. It recognized its mate. It was time to make them whole. She leaned in, inhaling his true scent, pine and winter and the clean smell of a coming snowstorm, a scent she had yearned for every day for 6 years. She sank her teeth into the junction of his neck and shoulder. It was not a violent act, but a firm, possessive claiming. A jolt of pure energy, silver and gold, erupted from the point of contact, flooding through both of them. The blackened, scarred mark on her hip blazed with silver light, healing itself, transforming back into the beautiful, intricate whirl it was meant to be. On Alaric's neck, a matching mark appeared, a silver brand that declared him hers. The bond didn't just snap back into place, it reforged itself, stronger and more brilliant than before, tempered in the fires of sorrow and sacrifice. 2 halves of a soul, violently torn apart, became one. When she drew back, Alaric's eyes were shining. The last of the shadows were gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated adoration. He framed her face with his hands and kissed her, a kiss that was 6 years in the making. It was a kiss of apology, of reunion, of promise. It was the kiss of a king for his queen, a wolf for his mate. The great hall erupted in a deafening roar of approval. The pack had its true leaders, united and whole. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom began to heal. Lysara Van Thorn was stripped of her name and titles and exiled to the desolate Ironwood Isles, a fate worse than death for someone so obsessed with status. Her conspirators were dealt with according to their crimes. The kingdom, under the joint rule of Alaric and Selene, began to thrive. Alaric's strength and strategic mind were now tempered by Selene's compassion and innate wisdom. The people loved her. She was not just a queen who had appeared from nowhere. She was the moon mother of their oldest tales, a symbol of hope and rebirth. Their life settled into a rhythm of peaceful joy. Alaric proved to be a doting, attentive father, making up for lost time with every moment he could. He taught Leo how to track, how to read the stars, and how to wield a wooden sword. Selene would watch them, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She had gone from a terrified, hidden mother to a beloved queen, all because of the unbreakable power of her love for her child. One evening, months later, Alaric found her standing on the balcony of their chambers, looking out at the full moon. He came up behind her, wrapping his strong arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He nuzzled her neck, right over the spot where her claiming mark now resided. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he murmured, his voice a contented rumble against her skin. Selene smiled, placing her hands over his. She tilted her head back to look at him, her eyes glowing in the moonlight. "I was thinking about how a shattered heart can sometimes be put back together, stronger than it was before." He turned her in his arms, his expression serious. I will never break it again, Celine. I swear on this moon, on our sun, on my very soul. She reached up and touched his face. I know. And she did. The bond between them was a living thing now, a constant warm hum beneath her skin, a source of unshakable strength. She felt a familiar flutter in her womb and smiled, a secret, happy smile. Leo would not be an only child for much longer. Their family, once a secret hidden in the woods, was now the foundation of a healing kingdom. The rejected servant had become a legendary queen. The mad king had found his soul, and the hidden heir now had a family, a future, and a throne, all secured by a mother's ferocious, magical love. And that is how the rejected servant became the Alpha Queen. If you believe that true love is worth burning a kingdom down for, smash that like button. Subscribe for more epic shifter romances. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if you found out you were a secret queen?